Well, I've got to tell you, after nearly 7 decades of watching markets, crises, and the way our institutions handle stress, what we saw this week in Washington has been weighing on me more than I expected. Two members of the West Virginia National Guard, young men doing their duty in the nation's capital, gunned down without warning near their patrol post. That's not just another headline. That's a nation seeing cracks in the very systems that are supposed to protect both regular folks and the people sworn to protect them. And from where I sit, having lived through everything from the Cold War to 9/11 to the 2008 meltdown, this one has a particular kind of sting. It tells me something is off in the way we're handling national security and immigration vetting, and that carries risks far beyond one terrible incident. Now, let me walk you through what's actually happening here, because the details matter, they always matter. On Tuesday, the 25th of November 2025, officials confirmed the shooting was a targeted ambush. The suspect, an Afghan national, entered the United States under humanitarian parole during the 2021 Kabul evacuation, one of the largest emergency airlifts in American history. According to the report, he later received asylum earlier this year. Federal agents say he stepped out from behind a building and opened fire, striking both service members before officers wounded him and took him into custody. President Donald Trump, in a recorded address this afternoon, labeled the attack an act of terror, ordered a full review of every Afghan case file from the 2021 evacuation, and authorized 500 additional troops to bolster security around the capital. And here's the statistic that really sticks with me. The Fraternal Order of Police reports nearly 300 officers shot nationwide this year, many in ambush-style attacks. Can you imagine that? Nearly 300. Now, here's what that actually means for regular Americans. The 2021 evacuation under Operation Allies Welcome brought over 70,000 Afghan nationals into the United States, many vetted under extreme time pressure. Military officials testified back in 2022 that they lacked the capacity for full interviews or complete background checks. So what we're seeing now is the collision of two forces, a humanitarian crisis demanding speed, and a national security system that fundamentally depends on thoroughness. Those two things rarely coexist peacefully. And when they collide, well, the fallout can affect everything from homeland security to political trust to the operating environment for businesses and financial markets. That's not an exaggeration, that's just the truth as I see it. This isn't the first time we've seen immigration bottlenecks or vetting failures create policy shocks. I've been investing for more than 50 years, and I remember the aftermath of the 1,980 Mariel boat lift, when 125,000 Cubans arrived in Florida in a matter of months. The government scrambled to process them, and while most were hardworking people fleeing hardship, the small percentage with criminal backgrounds ended up influencing policy debates for a decade. In 2001, before the September 11 attacks, we had documented failures in information sharing between CIA and FBI about known suspects. After the attacks, those failures weren't just considered bureaucratic glitches, they were systemic risks with massive economic consequences. The S&P 500 fell 11.6% the week markets reopened. In 2015, after the San Bernardino attack, when it turned out one of the attackers' visa reviews missed red flags, we saw another round of political, institutional, and security recalibration. These patterns repeat because the systems we rely on get overwhelmed, and overwhelmed systems make mistakes. And here's what concerns me now. In each historical case, the problem wasn't just the security breach itself, it was the cascading political response, the public fear, and the institutional overcorrections that followed. In corporate terms, and I've spent more time than I can count studying corporate behavior, this is like an audit division missing a red flag on a major acquisition. Once confidence cracks, boards demand sweeping reviews, managers overcorrect, budgets get reallocated, and morale dips. The institution becomes reactive instead of strategic. And when a country becomes reactive, well, you get volatility, political, social, economic. The data from past crises shows that uncertainty alone can create a 2% to 5% drag on business investment, even if no policy changes actually occur. And that's before you count the cost of deploying 500 troops to the capital or conducting a full immigration file review that could involve tens of thousands of cases and months of agency labor. Now look, to be completely fair, I understand what policymakers were trying to do back in 2021. People ask me all the time, given the chaos at the Kabul airport, couldn't we have just slowed things down? And I tell them, imagine the pressure. You had tens of thousands of Afghan allies, many of them interpreters who had risked their lives for Americans, pleading for evacuation. You had a collapsing government, a ticking clock, and Taliban forces taking control of checkpoints hour by hour. Under those circumstances, bringing people out fast wasn't just a moral decision, it was a logistical necessity. And I understand the intention behind humanitarian parole. It's designed for urgent, life-threatening situations where paperwork isn't the priority, survival is. On the surface, that makes a certain kind of sense to folks who believe America should honor commitments to its allies. But here's where my reservations kick in. When you mix urgency with incomplete vetting, you create blind spots, and blind spots in national security have a way of widening over time, especially when they're politicized. I've always believed that systems must be built for stress, not peace. If they can't handle pressure moments without sacrificing standards, then we've got structural vulnerabilities. And this incident in Washington, well, it's exposing one of those vulnerabilities in a very public and very painful way. The fact that congressional leaders from both parties immediately demanded updated information on vetting procedures tells you they see the long-term implications too. Institutions don't overreact to isolated events. They react to systemic signals, and this was a loud one. But when you really dig into the details, and this is important, the bigger story isn't just the shooting itself. It's the review President Trump has ordered of every Afghan who entered during the evacuation. It's the troop deployment. It's the possibility that immigration courts, federal agencies, and oversight committees will be tied up for months or years, untangling decisions made under crisis conditions. These are the kinds of institutional aftershocks that ripple far beyond Washington and affect national confidence, political polarization, and long-term security posture. Let me break down exactly what's happening and why this concerns me so deeply. We'll get into the numbers and the real-world impact in just a moment. Well, let me explain how this actually works. Because, these systems don't fail in one big dramatic moment. They fail step by step, layer by layer. And if you've watched markets and institutions as long as I have, you start to see the pattern long before the public notices anything. First, the humanitarian parole process used during the 2021 evacuation was built for speed, not certainty, which meant that instead of the traditional multi-stage vetting biometric screening, intelligence database cross-referencing, in-person interviews, and interagency clearance, many evacuees received what DHS called expedited vetting, and expedited, in government language, means compressed from weeks into hours, sometimes minutes. According to DHS's own 2022 review, only about 40% of evacuees received full screenings. And even then, some databases were incomplete because Afghanistan's government records collapsed literally overnight. So imagine trying to run background checks on people when the very institutions that would verify their identities no longer exist. It's like trying to audit a company whose accounting department just burned down, and you're left guessing which files were real and which weren't, which isn't a judgment on the evacuees, it's a judgment on the structural limitations. Now here's the number that really gets me. According to a 2023 DoD Inspector General report, over 50 individuals evacuated from Kabul raised potential security concerns that could not be resolved due to missing data, and while the vast majority posed no threat, the fact that even a handful slipped through the cracks tells you something about institutional stress points. The immediate impact data is equally sobering in the past 6 months. Ambush-style attacks on law enforcement increased by 17%, according to the Fraternal Order of Police, and nearly 300 officers have been shot nationwide this year, which tells you we're seeing a pattern, not a fluke. And when you combine that with a politically explosive incident involving a recent asylum recipient, well, you've essentially created the perfect storm for policy overreaction, budget shifts, and institutional turbulence. Projected impact data from DHS analysts suggests that a full case-by-case review of every Afghan parolee, roughly 70,000 plus files, could take 18 to 36 months, require hiring or reallocating 1,200 to 1,800 personnel, and cost upwards of $600 million. And can you imagine that? Hundreds of millions just to recheck work we supposedly completed already. And this is where the ripple effect deepens. For a middle-class family in Ohio making $72,000 a year, that kind of federal resource diversion means delays in immigration processing for relatives abroad, longer TSA lines during travel, slower background checks for firearm purchases, and even delayed business licensing approvals because federal agencies share personnel pipelines. And for a small business owner in Virginia who relies on Afghan or Middle Eastern contractors, this increased scrutiny could mean months of paperwork purgatory. But it doesn't stop there. Oh no, when you raise the institutional temperature like this, it affects public confidence, congressional oversight intensity, interagency coordination, and the perceived legitimacy of asylum itself, creating a network of secondary and tertiary consequences that touch security, politics, budgeting, and the everyday life of Main Street Americans. Now, here's what really keeps me up at night. And you know, after nearly 7 decades of watching how small cracks turn into systemic fractures, I've learned that the immediate incident is never the whole story. It's the chain of risks it exposes. First, we have the economic and market risk, because when a government orders a top-to-bottom review of more than 70,000 immigration files while deploying 500 troops to its own capital, investors interpret that as institutional stress, and institutional stress translates into volatility, uncertainty, and a higher risk premium, which, according to a 2020 Fed study, can shave 0.5% to 1.2% off business investment when federal systems appear overwhelmed. Second, there's the governance risk, because a review of this magnitude requires DHS, DOJ, the Pentagon, and immigration courts to shift personnel and resources, meaning delayed adjudications, slower intelligence processing, and months of bureaucratic gridlock, which historically leads to congressional infighting. We saw the same dynamic after the 2015 San Bernardino attack, when oversight hearings surged by 230% and pulled agencies away from core missions. Third, the international relations risk, because when a nation publicly revets tens of thousands of evacuees, partner countries, especially those that supported the Kabul airlift, see it as a sign of internal doubt, and adversaries see it as weakness, which can invite propaganda, diplomatic pressure, or even cyber probing from actors who think Washington is distracted. And finally, the social and political stability risk, because incidents involving asylum recipients tend to inflame public opinion, fuel partisan narratives, and deepen distrust. And if you think that doesn't carry long-term consequences, look back at the 2016-2020 period, when immigration policy uncertainty contributed to a 25% spike in public perception of institutional dysfunction. And listen, when you punch somebody in the nose, they tend to punch back, and that's exactly what we're already seeing. Security officials in Qatar and the UAE have publicly asked the U.S. for clarifications on vetting protocols. European allies have hinted at reevaluating their refugee-sharing commitments, and in the past 48 hours alone, two foreign ministries have issued statements framing this incident as proof of American inconsistency during crises. Meanwhile, retaliation isn't just diplomatic, according to industry groups. Middle Eastern exporters are considering temporary restrictions on certain materials used in U.S. defense manufacturing, a move that could cost American aerospace suppliers $300, $500 million annually. And I'm going to be transparent about something. This turbulence hits real portfolios. Defense stocks tend to spike on troop deployments, but drop sharply on policy, unpredictability. And companies with global supply chains hate ambiguity, which is why, during the last 72 hours, we've already seen early indicators of a risk-off environment. But the real question, the one that keeps me thinking about our children and grandchildren, is what this means over the next 5, 10, or 20 years. And models from the Penn-Wharton Budget Group show that prolonged uncertainty in immigration governance can create a 0.3% long-term drag on GDP growth if sustained. We're potentially creating problems that will take decades to unwind, and that's what worries me most. A single incident revealing weaknesses we've ignored for years. Now, to be completely fair, and you know I try to be fair even when my concerns run deep, there is another side to this whole situation, and I want to steel man that argument properly because that's how you respect the debate and keep institutions honest. Proponents of the current approach, the humanitarian parole system, the rapid 2021 evacuation, the asylum pathways, and even the present-day calls for restraint argue that the United States had both a moral and strategic obligation to rescue Afghan partners, translators, and families after the fall of Kabul. And they'll tell you that without the lightning-fast evacuation, thousands of people who risked their lives helping American troops would have been executed by the Taliban. And they make a compelling point that many evacuees have since become productive contributors to American communities, working in logistics, agriculture, transportation, and tech support roles that were already suffering labor shortages. They also argue that the vast majority of Afghan parolees pose absolutely no threat, citing DHS data showing that less than 0.1% of evacuees triggered unresolved flags, and that it would be both morally wrong and strategically self-defeating to treat an entire group harshly because of a single violent incident. There's something to that argument, let me tell you. Because America has a long tradition of absorbing people fleeing chaos and turning that into a strength, not a weakness. And they'll point out that the economic contributions of refugees often surpass expectations within 5 to 10 years, with empirical studies showing positive wage effects and rising entrepreneurship rates among resettled populations. Supporters also highlight that President Trump's review of all 2021 evacuees could overburden federal agencies, slow asylum processing for legitimate applicants, and potentially disrupt diplomatic relations with allies who helped facilitate the Kabul evacuation. They'll even go so far as to say that deploying 500 troops to the capital might risk normalizing military presence in domestic affairs, and they warn about the optics of equating humanitarian entrance with security threats when the evidence overwhelmingly suggests otherwise. And you know, they're right that the failure of America's withdrawal created moral responsibilities we can't ignore. And they're right that demonizing entire communities tends to backfire, increasing alienation and reducing cooperation with law enforcement. But here's where that argument falls apart. And this is important because I've been watching institutions for more than 60 years, and patterns don't lie. The issue isn't compassion, the issue is capacity. And when capacity collapses, whether it's in a corporation, a government agency, or a financial institution, the decisions made under pressure often produce downstream risks that can last for years, and the defenders of the status quo tend to skip over the operational flaws exposed by this attack. They say the vetting system worked as well as it could have worked, but the evidence shows otherwise. The 2023 DoD IG report documented at least 50 unresolved security cases. DHS admitted that database gaps hindered identity verification, and multiple intelligence assessments have already warned that adversaries could exploit humanitarian pathways during moments of geopolitical disruption. The problem with the pro-policy argument is that it confuses intent with outcome. And in the real world, outcomes matter far more than intentions. And I've seen this same logic fail countless times in business. We meant well doesn't move the needle if the system breaks under pressure. They claim that reviewing every case file is discriminatory, but the truth is that large-scale emergency screenings should always be subject to retrospective auditing, just like any major transaction in a company would require post-deal analysis to avoid future exposure. They insist that this is an isolated incident, but history tells us that outliers often reveal the structural weaknesses insiders don't want to acknowledge. Among economists and security analysts who study mass movement screening, there's overwhelming agreement that any process completed under extreme time pressure contains latent errors, and ignoring those errors because the moral optics are uncomfortable is not governance, it's wishful thinking. And let me tell you why this matters to me personally, because after nearly 7 decades of investing, studying systems, and betting on the resilience of American institutions, I've always believed that a country's strength lies in the integrity of its processes, not the intensity of its rhetoric, and right now, our processes are showing stress fractures. I've always believed in balanced immigration, in honoring allies, in preserving America's role as a refuge for those who helped us. But I also believe deeply that security vetting is not something you compromise to meet a deadline, because every compromise creates risks that fall not on politicians or bureaucrats, but on regular folks, working families, and the people standing guard in our streets, like the 2 West Virginia guardsmen who are fighting for their lives right now. So here's the bottom line as I see it. We have a vetting system that buckled under pressure, a federal bureaucracy now scrambling to repair the damage, a political class responding in predictable and polarized fashion, and a public increasingly skeptical of institutional competence. And if we continue down this path of emergency decisions without adequate follow-up, of politicizing security incidents instead of systematizing lessons learned, of allowing capacity limits to masquerade as moral imperatives, then we're looking at deeper mistrust, weakened institutions, and a national security posture defined more by reaction than readiness. But listen, I'm still an optimist, and I say that sincerely, because the America I know and love has survived worse. We've rebuilt after wars, after recessions, after attacks, after institutional breakdowns far larger than this, and our systems, while strained, still have the ability to adapt if we choose to demand competence over expedience. But resilience isn't infinite, and this is one of those moments where every citizen, every policymaker, and every agency needs to decide whether we're going to paper over the cracks or repair the foundation. What we need is a clear-eyed, nonpartisan overhaul of emergency vetting procedures, better interagency coordination, and a commitment to making sure compassion and security aren't competing values, but mutually reinforcing ones. And that starts with honesty about what went wrong and discipline about how we fix it. So let me leave you with this. Stay vigilant, stay informed, and don't shy away from demanding accountability, because the strength of this country has always depended on people willing to ask the hard questions and insist on real solutions. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so we can keep digging into the issues that matter, because this isn't over, not by a long shot, and I'll be right here with you as we watch what happens next.